Good morning. On behalf of the Maryland Chamber of Commerce, welcome to our 2021 legislative session recap webinar. I'm Christine Ross, the President and CEO of the Maryland Chamber of Commerce. The 2021 legislative session was historic in so many ways, thanks to the safety measures and the new procedures brought about by COVID-19. But we persevered and finally made it to Sine Die last week. Our tenacious government affairs team, Ashley Duckman and Andrew Griffin, have worked hard to advocate on behalf of Maryland businesses, both large and small. And today we will dive into the details of the legislation that is important to you. Thank you for joining us today. Without further ado, I will turn it over to our senior policy analyst, Andrew Griffin. Andrew?
Thanks, Christine, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Andrew Griffin, I'm the Senior Policy Analyst here at the Maryland Chamber, joined by my colleague, Ashley Duckman, whose face I just saw pop up on the screen. We are going to review some of the top line items this morning that impacted or that are going to impact, could impact the business community or stand to impact the business community in the future. I think a lot of the things that we'll talk about today are items that died. However, they're things that we anticipate coming back again in the future, and so there should be plenty to talk about, probably more than we need to. So before we do that, though, I do want to review a couple things for those of you that are not familiar with the Chamber's process. So next slide, please. So kind of going into this legislative session, obviously a lot of people were calling it the COVID session. People were calling it, just there are a lot of top line items, police reform and things like that, that the General Assembly was going to be dealing with. From the Chamber's perspective, we were really going into this with a narrative and pushing out to the legislature. We were calling it the do no harm session, obviously kind of rolling into businesses trying to recover, and there was a lot of things on the table, and we knew that there would still be some policies that would do harm to businesses and not just kind of helping them getting their feet back underneath them. And so with that, the Chamber kind of went into this with three top priorities I just want to remind everyone of. One was addressing kind of the rising unemployment insurance costs for employers. Two were seeking some sort of liability protections for COVID-related suits. And three was general economic recovery for businesses, which we saw kind of come out as the relief bill, which we'll talk about, or the Governor's Relief Act. And so we'll talk about those further. But this is just our agenda for today. Next slide, please. And just a quick review again for those of you who may be familiar or may not be familiar with the Chamber's legislative process and kind of how we come up with our positions here internally. We have 10 policy committees which oversee all the different issue areas you could imagine. The way it works is legislation comes in, we review that legislation with the appropriate policy committee, which is really the breeding ground for the ideas, our positions, and anything that the Chamber may take up, let's say amendments for a bill, kind of all come out of our policy committees. We have 5 that meet standing meeting during session every single week, and 5 that meet on an as needed, as hoc kind of basis based on the amount of legislation. This session was very busy, and I think all 10 of those committees met more times than they may have liked. And then we have our kind of next level up as our legislative committee. And so the policy committees make these recommendations and they filter up to our legislative committee. And they take a look kind of at the broad landscape of everything and how the Chamber should be positioning. And they make and give the final say on the Chamber's positions, which we kind of carry out through our advocacy. So next slide, please. So again, I just want to touch on the unique situation that this session presented. Some of you may know, some of you may not know. Obviously, with the COVID-19 pandemic and the COVID virus and social distancing, it made traditional grassroots lobbying, which is what the Chamber does, much more challenging, that face-to-face interaction. And so some of the major changes that we saw, and I do want to give the appropriate thank yous and say that the General Assembly did a pretty good job of transparency and keeping everybody safe. But some of the major changes were testimony was submitted electronically this year instead of in person. I think I can say, at least personally here at the chamber, I hope that stays around. But it did create some challenges. There was 2-day lag time in getting things in. Each chamber had different rules on the number of witnesses they were going to take for public bill hearings between the Senate and the House. They had different rules, however, it was limited. And then finally, all the meetings, the floor sessions, the bill hearings, public bill hearings and their voting sessions were streamed and made public with video across the board, really for the first time. And again, I hope that that's something that will stay around kind of in the name of transparency. So next slide, please. So we're going to kind of dive into the bills here. I will start off and say that this is a short list. These are cherry-picked bills that we thought you all would want to hear about. The chamber did take position on roughly 95, 96 bills this year, so this is not all-encompassing. Again, some of our policy committees only dealt with a couple, while others, like our Labor and Employment Policy Committee or our Tax Policy Committee, deal with a ton of bills. And so if there's something you don't see on here and you want to follow up with us, please feel free to reach out to us or ask a question in the chat box and we'll address it. So we'll start off here, our Business Regulations and Operations Policy Committee. I want to just highlight Senate Bill 412 or House Bill 84. This is a right to repair bill. This is something that we've seen in the past. We saw it this session. I think we're going to continue to see it into the future. Really what this bill does is it would make more or less proprietary information for manufacturers or people that make products. I think the example I always use is something simple like a chainsaw. It would make certain information available to the consumers to be able to make self-repairs on that equipment. Obviously, it presents, as you can imagine, issues for the manufacturers and the business community in ensuring the safety and reliability of the products that they make. And so that's the position that we have taken here at the chamber. That bill ultimately did die. There wasn't any action on that this session. However, again, this is a conversation that's happening nationally across states. This is something I think that we can anticipate coming back. And so if that impacts you, we'll continue to have that discussion. Our Civil Liability Policy Committee, Senate Bill 210 and House Bill 508. This, like I mentioned at the beginning, was a chamber priority. And just to give some context, coming out of over what we've been experiencing the last year, the business community, particularly the small and medium-sized business community, in those that are public-facing, the COVID pandemic presented a lot of challenges. And one of those challenges was opening themselves up to negligent suits, basically frivolous lawsuits for, let's say, someone coming in to their store and saying, hey, I got the COVID-19 pandemic. I contracted COVID by walking into your store. I'm going to sue you for not ensuring a safe environment, X, Y, and Z. And so what Senate Bill 210, House Bill 508 did is it says that if a business would have said, if a business followed all the appropriate guidelines and recommendations of the CDC, the state health department, the county health department, they were making their best effort and in good faith trying to ensure the safety of their employees and the public while operating throughout this, that they would be held immune from liability from the contraction of COVID-19, those types of suits at the workplace. This was originally the bill came in, it was for 180 days going back to the start of the governor's emergency executive order. As the bill kind of the session went on, things had changed and the posture of the bill changed. And we thought that potentially there was going to be a little bit of life as we got towards the end of session in this. And however, it did end up dying. Immunity is a tough thing in Annapolis, and we knew that kind of going into it. And so, unfortunately, we're not able to get that across the finish line. But I'll pause there and ask you to see if you have anything to chime into this. Obviously, we worked on this a ton. If I left anything out.
No, I think you did a really good job summarizing, Andrew. This was a top chamber priority, and we worked extensively with members, particularly in the Senate, particularly with the Senate Republican caucus, on trying to move this across the goal line. The Senate sponsor, Senator Chris West, was a tremendous advocate for us in this. Just to Andrew's point, immunity is a really tough sell in Annapolis, and at the 11th hour, we just weren't able to convert our advocacy into a win on this one. And so that's a little bit disappointing, but we pressed forward and are grateful for the work that our friends in the Senate did for us on this, in spite of it not moving forward.
Yeah, and this again is a movement that happened across states. Roughly half the states in the U.S. had pursued some type of immunity for businesses. For these types of claims. We know, and I just saw a question pop up, this may be, have we seen many lawsuits due to the lack of immunity? The answer is we are seeing some suits, some COVID-related suits. The data it's still kind of in the infancy, but the suits are happening. And so many of them still kind of in the works. Obviously, with the court backlog, we haven't seen a ton of things kind of come out the finish line. And so that's kind of where we are with that.
Yeah, and I'll add in response to that question as well, how many lawsuits? Yeah, the data is a bit lagging on the actual number. We can cite many examples. We can also cite many business owners who are bringing us documentation, things they're receiving in the mail from attorneys that are threatening lawsuits. Now, maybe it hasn't converted into an official filing that we can count as part of our data, but we've certainly seen plenty of documentation from business owners who are receiving those letters and who are fearful of what they may parlay into. So to Andrew's point, giving a number of lawsuits that are presently pending may not tell the whole story. And so it's something to be mindful of as we move forward.
Okay, kind of shifting gears here. Our Workers' Compensation and Unemployment Insurance Policy Committee was very busy this session. And I'm going to kind of touch on a couple of the top bills that we dealt with. Again, two of these at least chamber priorities. The first one here, Senate Bill 496. This was the Relief Act. Before we kind of dive into the experience rating and the unemployment portion of this, I do want to say that this bill was a chamber priority really in our economic recovery pillar. This is kind of the vehicle that the governor and legislative leaders used for funding kind of that we saw small business financing, loans, those kinds of things, additional funding to certain departments within state government. This was kind of the relief package that was pursued. And so that was a priority. We're happy that that passed in that vein. Here on the unemployment related issue, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, frankly, through no fault of their own, going back a year to March, businesses were forced to close. Part of that, unfortunately, is businesses were forced to lay off their employees. Those layoffs, for those of you that know, translate into the unemployment insurance taxes that have an impact on the unemployment insurance taxes that are paid by the employer. And there's two components to that, to what goes into calculating an unemployment tax rate. First is what's called the experience rating. And essentially what that is the Department of Labor calculates an experience rating more or less based on how many layoffs a business has had over the previous rolling 3 years. So as you can imagine, with businesses being closed, tons of businesses are laying people off, and that's negatively impacting their experience rating, forcing their unemployment insurance taxes to go up out of their control. And so the governor in Senate Bill 496, the Relief Act, what was the provision that was put in to address the experience rating issue was the state said, well, we're only going to calculate your experience rating from the 3 years prior to 2020. So 2017, 2018, and 2019. So the 2020 year, was not going to be taken into calculation for an individual's experience rating. So essentially it was going to remain unchanged. So in that sense, your unemployment insurance taxes would not be going up. Senate Bill 811, which also passed, addressed the second component of that calculation, and that's the table of rates. And so the state utilizes, and this is based off of the level of the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund, a table of rates which calculates basically the percentage tax that you pay. And so there's an A to F table, and the table, I think the lowest is 0.03% or 0.3%, and the highest is 13%. And based on your experience rating, how many people you've laid off, and where the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund is at that time, your business falls into a tax rate on that table. And so with so many individuals laid off and so many unemployment benefits being drawn, as you can imagine, the trust fund was brought to nearly nothing. I do know, the state had to take out loans, forgivable loans from the federal government to replenish some of that. But because it was drawn down so low, we switched from the lowest possible table of rates to the highest possible table of rates, table F. And so that causes everybody's across the board, all businesses, whether you laid someone off or not, it causes your unemployment insurance taxes to go up. So Senate Bill 811, what it did is it is saying, and this is only applying for FY22 and forward, is that we're going to stay in table C. So as opposed to shifting from table A to table F, we'll go from table C in 2022, table D in 2023, table E in 2024. And then during that time, if the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund rebounds slightly and puts you in a higher table than that, puts the state in a higher table of rates than that, then that is what we will use. And essentially, this is a way of just phasing in what are going to be increased unemployment insurance costs. So that passed. We're happy to see that pass. That was a consensus bill across the aisle, I think, across the aisle support. And so we're happy to see that. And so really, as far as unemployment insurance goes, these two bills really addressing the two major issues that the chamber came into the legislative session looking to fix.
Yeah, Andrew, if I could just pop in really quick. The question in the chat is, do we have an indication of what rates will be in 2022 or when this info may be made available? So as reflected in what Andrew discussed in 811, in a best case scenario, we're going to see ourselves in table C, whatever that percentage calculation is, but it's hard to predict where we'll be in 2022 because we don't exactly know where we will be in the pandemic and economic recovery and how quickly the trust fund itself will rebound in terms of what the balance will be at the time the snapshot is taken in September 2021. So it's hard to predict an exact amount. Obviously, we're disappointed that this $1 billion in federal funds and this Senate Bill 811 weren't able to assist employers for their FY21 rates. That was something that we were frustrated by, but based on how the math went, based on when these funds were made available, based on how DOL had to do its calculations in accordance with what is mandated by federal law, we just weren't able to get them to make it work for 21. So we're looking forward, we're looking at 22, and in a best case scenario, the trust fund has rebounded significantly because our economy has rebounded significantly and people are working again. And then we see sort of this best case scenario at table C, and even optimistically, potentially there is room to move to table B. We're not beholden to table C. It's just that it shall be no worse than table C. So hopefully that answered your question, Tom.
Yeah, just following up on one piece that Ashley said. So towards the end of the legislative session, the governor, as many of you may have seen in conjunction with the Senate President and the Speaker, they are going to use slightly over, I think it's 1.3 billion of federal funds that they received to replenish or backfill the unemployment trust fund. So that will help buoy that balance a little bit to help prevent the table sliding. So helping to keep rates a little more reasonable. Again, something that the chamber, we were big supporters of, very adamant about, and we're happy to see done. So kind of switching gears here to workers' compensation, we saw a ton of workers' compensation related legislation this session. And I want to highlight just one particular bill and then kind of a host of bills I'll talk about together. But Senate Bill 461, House Bill 463, workers' compensation, dealing with medical cannabis compensation and benefits. This is something, again, we've seen in the past, a bill, and because this bill was unsuccessful this session, we will see this again in the future. And what the aim of this legislation simply is, it gives the Workers' Compensation Commission the ability to require an employer to pay for medical cannabis as a legal treatment for injuries sustained on the job. So it's alternative medicine. However, the other component to this that was not talked about a ton during session is that an employer, it goes into how an employer defends against workers' compensation suits. An employer can only defend if an individual was using marijuana on the job legally and they had a medical card. An employer is unable to prove, basically, an employer is unable to prove whether or not an individual was under the influence of medical cannabis or non-medical cannabis on the job, really giving that leg of defense to whether or not someone was under the influence. It takes that ability away from a business, was another component of this piece of legislation. And so there were several issues. I know that this bill continues to be worked on in the interim. It was worked on last interim, and it's a top priority of the bill. It's certainly the Senate sponsor, Vice Chair Feldman in the Senate. It's a priority for him. And so it's something I think we'll continue to see come back. And I know some of you probably on here worked with us on this issue. And so we just wanted to flag it to make sure that if this is something that impacts you, and medical cannabis on the job site is something that concerns you, to be on the lookout for this. And then kind of lastly, I'm taking a host of these bills together, is workers' compensation presumption, particularly as it relates to COVID-19. We saw 7 or 8 bills, particularly addressing this issue in a variety of different industries. However, what this legislation was attempting to do, obviously because of COVID-19, was saying that if someone contracted COVID-19, they were able to file a workers' compensation claim, and it was going to be presumed that they contracted that on the job. And so obviously, as you can imagine, there are tons of issues. The presumption really takes away an ability to say, hey, well, they may have been doing risky things outside of work in their social life. This was a major issue. So very luckily, none of the presumption bills did pass. I think just highlighting for us at the chamber, and maybe many of you watching, presumption has never been applied to private industry before. This was the first time that they were really looping in private entities and certain private industries outside of, let's say, being a first responder or a police officer or a firefighter, something along those lines. And then even kind of going into the data, while we can maybe make reasonable assumptions about who is more likely to contract COVID or the other, there isn't hard data that says, yes, a teacher is much more likely to contract COVID-19 than a firefighter or than a grocery store worker. That data doesn't really exist quite yet, which is what is seen typically with other presumptions that exist, is a body of work that says, no, if you work in a certain industry, you are at a higher risk of maybe contracting this disease or sustaining this type of injury. So next slide, please. All right, kind of shifting gears to tax, probably to the second of our more active committees, Tax and Labor and Employment. The first we have here is Senate Bill 787. I have it listed here as a pass-through and carve-out, but this is related to kind of the digital advertising tax, digital goods tax, which was passed last year. And I'm actually going to kick this over to Ashley to talk about.
Sure. So the base bill that we're going to talk about, Senate Bill 787, this was in response to the tax on digital advertising that the General Assembly passed last session that the governor vetoed and that the General Assembly overrode. The 787 bill was introduced by Senator Ferguson and Delegate Lukey in the House as an attempted sort of fix to the previous bill. And what 787 did was it essentially said that, businesses for whom this tax was intended to target are not able to, quote, pass through that cost onto small businesses through a line item or a surcharge that appears on their invoicing or bills, which we all know is problematic because you can't tell a business that they're not able to pass on their increased costs. What this bill said is that you can't do it on a line item or a surcharge. It also had some exemption language in it for broadcasters. The chamber opposed the base bill as it existed when it was introduced, but later, very late in session, this sort of changed a little bit, and I'm going to talk through that. So previously, last year also, the General Assembly passed House Bill 932, which was the a sales tax on digital goods. We had largely stayed out of that last year. We did not oppose or support or really get involved in on House Bill 932 because many states across the country had already set precedent on expanding their sales tax to digital goods, and our members were largely in favor of us staying neutral on that bill. Ultimately, the governor did veto 932 last year, and the General Assembly overrode that veto. Where things got a little tricky is that interpreting House Bill 932, the comptroller had issued some guidance in late March, a guidance document on the tax on digital goods. And there was some problematic interpretation of House Bill 932. In particular, the comptroller's office had interpreted that the sales, subscription, or license to use a software application is included in the list of digital products, as well as educational and business seminars that are conducted digitally or virtually would be subject to the tax. And our membership and the chamber felt very strongly that this was not the General Assembly's intent when they passed House Bill 932. Were it their intent, we would have been much more involved in discussions around it. And so we, in working with the comptroller's office and other stakeholders, determined that a legislative fix was going to be necessary in order to provide the comptroller's team clear and concise legislative guidance on what should and should not be subject to the digital good sales tax. And so we worked with a large group of tax experts, state and local tax experts from Maryland and also across the country, quite frankly, on a series of amendments to address that lack of clarity around whether or not enterprise software or software as a service, the very large packages that companies use to provide their software, should be subject to the sales tax, which we believe the General Assembly didn't intend to do. And so those amendments that addressed ensuring that software, enterprise software, software as a service, as well as educational seminars and business seminars would not be subject to the digital goods tax were tacked on to Senate Bill 787 as the vehicle. And so 787 with our fix, as well as the base digital ad tax issues, ultimately did pass both the House and Senate. And so we are grateful, obviously, to get that clarity and that fix on digital goods. It would have amounted to a very significant tax liability for companies who are purchasing and using enterprise software. And so that fix is very good. Obviously, there are still a lot of problematic parts to the base bill on the ad tax side of the equation. But what we understand is that we believe, and this is obviously subject to change because it hasn't happened yet, we believe that the governor is going to let this become law without his signature. So that's where we are on that. It's a little bit technical and wonky on the tax side. And so if there are follow-up questions on the amendments and what they did, please reach out to Andrew or myself offline, and we're happy to give you more clarity.
Thanks, Ashley.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to talk about kind of the next item here is a perennial. And so many of you are probably familiar with it, but it bears mentioning again, and that's combined reporting. These are the three bills that we saw this legislative session addressing combined reporting. Before I kind of get into exactly what combined reporting is and what it does, I will tell you the momentum for this type of tax structure has kind of come and gone, and I think we're in a current state of momentum for this type of business tax structure. And so it's something that we're going to continue to see. We're going to continue to talk about. I think you can expect the General Assembly to continue to take a hard look at this and whether or not it is the correct tax structure for our business community here in Maryland or not. And then, so if you're not familiar with it, I would say become familiar with it. And so more or less combined reporting, what it does is it changes, it takes all the subsidiaries of a company and it, even those that, let's say, exist across state lines, it puts you into a unitary or a combined reporting group for tax purposes. And it says all the sales that you made in very low level example here. Let's say you own a chain of fast food restaurants. You have 5 of them. 2 of them are in Maryland. 3 are in other states. All 5 of them, the revenue is your sales are combined. And then Maryland would assign an apportionment factor to your sales. So let's just say they determine that 60% of your sales were made in Maryland. Then you pay a tax on that 60% of whatever the apportionment factor is that the state determines and is assigned to the total sales for all of your subsidiaries is what you pay tax on. And so that presents a ton of problems for tax payment purposes. It leads to both the overpayment and underpayment of taxes. Obviously, since an apportionment factor is determined, you're not paying taxes on the actual sales that are made here in Maryland. It is notoriously fluxes with the economy because you're importing sales that you made in other states. Maybe the sales that happened in another state were really poor or were really good. So you're importing sales that shouldn't be attributed here in Maryland, but may make your sales look better or worse than they are. And so it leads to a ton of problems. With that said, it's something we're going to continue to talk about. It is much different than our current single sales factor that we use for corporate taxes here currently, which is a recent change here in Maryland. It was only made a couple of years ago and will be fully phased in this year, at the end of this year. And so we haven't even seen the full repercussions of that yet. But again, we'll continue to talk about this, and it's something that the Chamber will continue to work on. Moving on here, Senate Bill 578, decoupling. So this bill kind of changed drastically. Just so addressing the question, no, combined reporting did not pass. Senate Bill 578 came in and passed drastically different than what it was. However, still important, I think, for those on this call. And this is dealing with how the state couples and decouples from federal tax law. So changes that were made in the Federal CARES Act allowed businesses to take certain business tax deductions in previous tax years. And so in Maryland, we have a rule where anytime that the federal government makes a federal tax change that impacts state revenues more than X number of dollars, we automatically decouple from that. We don't follow that provision until the General Assembly comes back and they make a determination of whether or not they want to couple with that federal provision or not. However, it was silent on what we did to things impacting previous tax years. And so Senate Bill 578, which passed, says that if the federal government makes any changes which impacts state revenue in past years, that the state would automatically decouple from that. And so the bill came in previously decoupling from 3 very specific business tax provisions, those that were part of the CARES Act that were designed to influx cash into businesses to help them keep the lights on and the doors open to kind of get through the pandemic. And so the bill, again, did kind of change form to something that is substantially more palatable for us. But I wanted to flag it for everyone here. House Bill 804, Whistleblower Reward Program. So this bill did pass. And what this bill does is it establishes a reward program for individuals who may report the underpayment or non-payment of taxes to the comptroller's office. And if that report leads to the recovery of some of the non or underpaid amount, then the individual is eligible for a reward ranging from 15 to 30% of the taxes that are recovered. The bill, that is very high level of what this program does. I can tell you that the comptroller did express their concerns with the bill, and they had some issue areas which I believe were worked out. The concern from the chamber is frankly that whether or not will this lead to kind of an increase in whistleblower activity, which doesn't lead to any increased revenue for the state, and more or less kind of false claims. That is to be determined. But again, this did pass. And then finally, I don't believe I have anything else here on the next slide, but House Bill 229 throwback rule. This I'm going to kind of pair with combined reporting as kind of a suite or a host of business tax related issues that the advocates believe will be a big boom in state revenue. But essentially the throwback rule says that if you make a product and you sell that product in a state that does not tax it, or you make income in a state that doesn't tax it, that is thrown back. That nowhere income, as it's called, is thrown back to Maryland to be taxed. This has been introduced over the last several years. It will continue to be introduced in the future. It did not go anywhere this session, but again, it is something we're going to continue to talk about. I can't say that enough, and many times you'll see it kind of put together in the same package with combined reporting as a way of changing business tax structure to make sure, or an attempt to make to get more revenue for the state. All right, shifting gears a little bit to our probably most active policy committee, and that's our Labor and Employment Policy Committee. And the first bill we have here is kind of large and encompassing and has a lot to it. The chamber, we spent a lot of time working on this bill this session. That's House Bill 581, the Essential Worker Protection Act. I'll kick this over to Ashley as well to talk about.
Sure, I'm happy to. This, as Andrew mentioned, was probably one of the bills that we spent the most amount of time on, both internally with our Labor and Employment Policy Committee and our internal working group that we established to work through the provisions of this bill, and externally as we lobbied to try to make this a better posture for business owners in Maryland. So House Bill 581, introduced by Chairman Derek Davis, Senate Bill 486 by Senator Augustine. That was the cross file on the Senate side. This was a bill that was pushed by the labor unions largely, and as introduced, it would have established a number of new costly and onerous requirements for Maryland job creators. As it was introduced, that would have included hazard pay. There was a provision that would have added an additional $3 an hour in hazard pay dating back to the start of a state of emergency. There was a provision that would have required employers to provide financial assistance for unreimbursed healthcare costs, including transportation to and from healthcare services for any essential worker who becomes sick or is injured if the sickness or injury is related to the emergency. And it also would have, as introduced, established a new leave program. That original language would have required employers to provide at least 3 days of bereavement leave and 14 days of paid health leave during a state of emergency. Even more concerning, in the introduced language, the definitions of emergency, essential employer, and essential worker were really broad, overly ambiguous, not well defined, and they went really way beyond the scope of the COVID-19 emergency that we're presently dealing with. In fact, we were scratching our heads trying to figure out which employers were not essential rather than those who were in the original construct of the bill. After the original bill hearings, I will also say we did a ton of grassroots on this with our members. I noticed some of our Federation partners are on this call. Huge thank you to our Federation partners who are our local and county chambers who just help us tremendously with grassroots advocacy and making sure that business owners across the state were aware of how problematic and costly this bill would have been. They weighed in heavily prior to bill hearings, which was great. Post bill hearings in both the House and Senate, Chairman Davis on the House side established a legislative work group, which consisted of 4 senators, 4 delegates, 3 representatives from business, of which the Chamber of Commerce had a place and a seat at that table, as well as 3 representatives from labor. 3 meetings were held. There were a lot of discussions, not a lot of meat on the bone. This was a really tricky one to navigate because there was a lot contained within this bill, and it was really challenging in terms of some of the definitions and how things would work and a lot of different hypotheticals. Ultimately, the real work on this took place in the House Economic Matters Subcommittee on Business Regulation, led in large part by Delegate C.T. Wilson. And through that process, things were really stripped way, way down. The definition of emergency was narrowed down to a catastrophic public health emergency as it exists in existing law. The list of defined essential workers and employers was stripped so that in a future public health emergency, an essential worker or employer will be defined by the governor in consultation with federal and state recommendations and agencies specific to that emergency. Many of the ambiguous terms and provisions related to workplace safety that were in the bill were removed. Those that were left really were just meant to align with existing federal and state law through existing federal and state regulatory agencies like OSHA and MOSH. So nothing really new or problematic there. The only provision considerably significant to employers that was left in is that there is a leave provision that remained in the bill, and that is that employers in a catastrophic public health emergency that are defined as essential by the governor shall pay paid sick leave or paid health leave to employees up to 14 days in the state of emergency for, I think there are 6 reasons outlined in the bill. The key part of what passed is that that provision, that leave, is only triggered if federal or state money is available to reimburse employers for that cost. So if there is no money available for employers to be reimbursed, that provision is not triggered and the leave shall not be applied. In that, employers are able to ask for verification and documentation for the leave. At the 11th hour over in the Senate, there was an effort to try to strip that provision so that employers wouldn't be allowed to ask for verification. The House pushed back, and fortunately that stayed in. But that is all to say that based on how far the bill was stripped back, the chamber was in a neutral posture and a neutral position when it passed. I think from where we started to where we ended up is a tremendous victory for the business community at large. And so we're delighted to have worked with our federation partners and lots of other stakeholders to get the outcome that we did. Still working on gathering intel as to where the governor's office is on this particular bill. Our understanding today, and again, of course, this could change, is that he may let this become law without his signature. And so, again, thank you to all the folks over here. I just want to see if there were any questions related to this one in the chat. But yeah, thank you all so much, that those of you who are on that were helpful in this effort or that served on our Labor and Employment Policy Committee or that internal working group. This was a big one for us, and I think it was a really good outcome. That's all I have, Andrew, on that one.
All right, good. Do you want to talk about family as well, or?
Sure, yeah, happy to. So another of our labor and employment bills that we spend a considerable amount of time on, paid family and medical leave. So this is Senate Bill 211, introduced by Senator Hayes, House Bill 375, introduced by Delegate Valderrama. This is not one that we're a stranger to. This has been around for a number of sessions. The bill would have established a family and medical leave program to be administered under the supervision of the Division of Unemployment Insurance within the Department of Labor, as if they don't have enough to do right now. Generally, the program would provide up to 12 weeks of benefits to an employee who is taking partially or unpaid leave for certain family and medical reasons, which are outlined in the bill. And then, of course, probably the most large component, the bill would have established a family fund to cover the cost of those benefits at at the expense of both employers and employees in a 50-50 split at a rate that would be determined by the Department of Labor. We've had a long-standing work group on this issue. A number of folks, some of whom I see that are on the call, have been working on this with us for at least the past 2 sessions. And let me preface by saying that the Chamber and our members are not opposed in concept to the idea of a family and medical leave program. Lots of other states are moving in this direction. The federal government, at the federal level, we're hearing this conversation. Our problem is with this bill specifically as it's drafted and structured. And we've worked over 2 sessions to try to work together with the advocates and the bill sponsor to try to come to a better place. We've raised continual concerns over the length of the leave that's provided. The idea that, according to the advocates, this is intended to be a new bank of leave rather than benefits for leave to which an employee is already entitled. And there's lots of other challenges with definitions and how broad they are, et cetera. In this session, most importantly, our biggest pushback had to do with the cost. Obviously, because there were no exemptions or carve-outs for small business owners, the cost of this would have been catastrophic for some of our job creators here in Maryland. So we spent a lot of time talking about the cost. After bill hearings happened, Senator Hayes did reach out to the chamber and our group to try to bring us together with the advocates. There was one meeting that happened to try to figure out how we're going to move forward on this. It really didn't materialize into anything, and the bill died in committee, never really made it out. But I will say, we fully anticipate and expect that this issue is going to come back year over year until the advocates for this bill are able to establish some kind of family and medical leave program. So we intend to keep our work group intact and continue to work with them throughout the interim, as well as with Delegate Valderrama and Senator Hayes to see where we can try to come to some agreement on some of the more problematic components of the language.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think broadly, looking forward to issues we're going to see in coming sessions. I think changes to existing leave programs and new leave programs are something that we can anticipate coming up. All right, just being mindful of the time, I'm going to kind of skip through, not skip through, but kind of breeze through a few of these, not to say that they are not of importance, but Senate Bill 105 and House Bill 289, peace orders, workplace violence. If anyone on today has worked on this, I just want to say congratulations. This has been an issue that they've worked on for many, many years in Annapolis, and it has finally passed. What this bill does is it gives the employer the ability to file a peace order on behalf of an employee for the employee's workplace. So this has really been pushed by certain organizations that see a lot of potential for workplace violence. It's something that we have supported in the past, and so we're really happy to see this measure pass. It's certainly a good thing for the employer and employees. Kind of moving on a little quick. Senate Bill 504, discrimination, employment, use of medical cannabis. Again, another cannabis-related bill. This particularly says that would have said did die. An employer was unable to consider someone for a job during the application process based on their holding a medical cannabis card or not. And unfortunately, this legislation did not take into account a lot of the issues that are experienced by Maryland employers. We have a very large government contracting sector here in Maryland. We have a lot of federal facilities here in Maryland, and a lot of those issues were simply not addressed, as well as a host of others. So Senate Bill 504 did die. I anticipate that this will come back in a reworked fashion next legislative session. And then finally here, this is actually a fairly large bill. I'm going to review over at 30,000 foot level, but House Bill 1326, this bill was making revisions to the Maryland Healthy Working Families Act. again, broadly, very big bill. The changes that it would have made very significant. But one, it was removing the exemptions for certain employees to this program, and it was expanding the definition of what constitutes a family member. Those are two of the top line items for this program. Some of the provisions of this were rolled into House Bill 581, that Essential Worker Protection Act that Ashley spoke about. So ultimately, this bill was withdrawn, but it does bear mentioning for the reason, like I said, some of the revisions and the provisions that were in House Bill 1326 are things that we can anticipate coming back. I do know that there is kind of a groundswell of advocates pushing for that. So I want to mention. Hitting on a couple more labor and employment bills, Senate Bill 801, House Bill 1154, making revisions to our State Economic Stabilization Act. This did pass very quickly. A bill was passed in the 2020 session, making changes to our state's Economic Stabilization Act, which basically has makes certain requirements of employers that are going to lay off employees. If they lay off a certain number of employees, they have to give notice to certain entities. This is essentially a state version of the Federal WARN Act, which many of you may be familiar with. The bill that passed in the 2020 session made a lot of big changes that really put the state's law significantly out of line with the federal law. But more, what it really did is it tacked on a $10,000 a day fine for employers who did not abide by the rules and regulations of the law. So we formed a working group over this interim and came up with a consensus bill to the advocates, really making some changes to bring the law back more in line with the Federal WARN Act. And so we're happy that that did pass. For those of you that this does impact, the state law should be much more in line with what you're currently experiencing with the federal law. So Senate Bill 834, this bill, which did die, but is something that we've seen in the past and we will continue to see in the future for sure, is making a drastic change to what constitutes harassment and sexual harassment in the workplace. Senate Bill 834 essentially completely reverses the standard that the judicially accepted standard, both that is used at the federal level, that's used across states, and what is accepted here in Maryland. We would be, it's my understanding, really the first state in the country, if Senate Bill 834 had passed, to completely reverse the federal standard. A lot of people compare this, they call it a workplace bullying bill, because it drastically increases what constitutes harassment in the workplace to a lot of actions that I don't know reasonable people would consider to be harassment. Senate Bill 911, this bill was essentially eliminating the caps on compensatory damages for unlawful employment practices and extending the statute of limitations to which suit could be brought and to which back pay could be recovered from 2 years to 3 years. And that bill did also die. And then finally, last but not least, I want to just hit on a couple energy and environment bills. The biggest one and the one that really sucked up the most number of headlines during the legislative session, Senate Bill 414, the Climate Solutions Now Act. This bill did ultimately die. The chambers, the Senate and the House, were unable to come to consensus on their versions of the bill. However, from the business community, this bill did a ton of things, and so I'm going to pick on really one provision, but it did a ton of things. It really increased the cost for the transportation sector, increased the cost for the commercial building sector, the construction of schools. It did a ton of stuff. However, what's most concerning from the broader business sector is that it was reversing the standard which is used here in Maryland when it comes to climate policy, and that ultimately long-term, a climate policy must have an overall net economic positive impact to the state and to the state's economy. So regardless of what the measures, it should positively benefit the economy. Senate Bill 414 completely erased that and more or less said, well, we don't care the impact that it has on the economy, just do it, more or less. And so that type of policy reversal is very troublesome and worrisome here for the state's business community. Finally, House Bill 36, producer responsibility. Again, this bill did die, but for those of you who are manufacturers or sellers of products, paper and packaging products, this bill would have required or made it illegal for you to produce, sell, or import for sale paper or packaging products unless you had an approved plan from the Maryland Department of the Environment, stewardship plan for the entire downstream life of that product. So once you sell that paper food container, what happens to it after consumer use? How are you going to recover it? How is it going to be recycled? How is it going to be turned into a secondary product? And so obviously extremely burdensome and unworkable almost, but that bill did die. It is something I think we can anticipate coming back. So, all right, we've talked all the way up until 3 minutes left. Oh, still more to say before I address questions. The chamber will not be submitting any veto requests at the end of this session. However, we did submit a letter to the governor addressing, which we talked about, Senate Bill 787, supporting the amendments to the digital ad tax bill for the digital goods tax fix. So we did submit a letter in support of those amendments, but that will be it, at least from the chamber, as far as vetoes go to the governor. So, with a couple minutes left.
Yeah, we have two minutes left, but we can go a little over if anyone has additional questions. That we've tried to keep up with what is in the chat, but if you have additional questions, please
pulling through here,
let us know.
And if you have questions about anything we didn't talk about today or address today, feel free, obviously, to follow up with myself or Ashley.
All right, not seeing anything else coming through, Andrew.
Yeah, I think we did. Well, we certainly appreciate you all joining us today. And like I said, we look forward to continue working with you, working with the legislature, and to work on many of these issues, which we know will be back. So
have a great day,
you.
everybody. Thank you.